Our next panel is on financial fraud and the elderly. We are very fortunate to have two speakers on this, Doug Shadell and Stephen Vernon. And with no further ado, I'll turn it over to them.
Can you hear me? Yes, thank you. My name is Doug Shadell. It's a pleasure to be here. And when Ken asked me if I wanted to come down to Stanford to talk about neuroscience, the law, and decision-making, I'm like, I would pay to come to something like that. I'm very interested in this topic, and having worked with Laura Carstensen at the Center for Longevity and her folks, just a bit by way of background, 2009, I stumbled onto a relationship with Laura's organization. I can't even remember, I was reading some articles that she had written just about positivity and how we change over the lifespan. And my background is in researching scam artists. I spent 10 years as a fraud investigator, 10 years working on consumer education, fraud prevention, and the last 10 years really trying to figure it out using research techniques and so forth. And you know, historically, the way we would try and stop fraud would be to warn people, let's say, these evil people are out there and you should be warned about them. And then I started reading these articles about positivity, where as we age, we start to select out negative information and focus on positive information. I'm like, well, hell, they're just rejecting all of my dire warnings about negative. And just, you know, where's the positivity thing? So it started to open us up to this idea that we really need to get more connected to, that practitioners need to get more connected to academia and vice versa, perhaps, in order to solve this problem. And so, you know, we've had several conferences. There was the creation of this research center for the prevention of financial fraud that just occurred last year at Stanford. I'm very excited about that because that really is an attempt to try and centralize the research that's been done. It's been characterized as just all over the map. If you look at the research on fraud, it's really been hit and miss. And what we're trying to do, and Laura's staff is trying to do, Shoshana and others, Martha Devi, is to centralize the research into one place and then make it accessible to people. And what I just want to do by way of introducing this, and then I want to turn it over to Steve, I'm going to talk more about sort of stranger fraud, you know, the telemarketers who call and the research that we've done in that area. And then Steve is going to talk more about really the tougher, in some ways, nut to crack, although they're both tough, which is fiduciary fraud and exploitation within the family context. We had a great electrifying conversation about that. We said, we should have just not done that and done it, you know, when we were in front of people. But anyway, the standard presentation that I give, which I will not bore you with because it's like 50 slides, is sort of the 4 Ps, and I call it prevalence, persuasion, profiling, and prevention. And I'm not going to go into great depth in each one of these, but just give you, I guess the whole hope is to generate conversation. Prevalence is this area of how much fraud is really out there. And I would start with the statement that we don't know, that it in fact is unknowable, that you cannot really know precisely how much fraud is out there because it's just so complicated to do methodologically. It's not that people haven't tried, and there are really good efforts at it. The Federal Trade Commission has done studies in 2004 and 2007. They do these national surveys where they survey 2,500 people and ask them detailed questions about their experiences with fraud. And they come up with a figure of about anywhere between 10 and 14% of the US adult population has been defrauded in the previous 12 months. And they ask them about specific types of fraud and so forth. That's 30 million people. That's a lot of people. And I would suggest that that is a floor. And the reason I say it's a floor is because our studies have shown, last year we did a study of 723 known victims, people who had been independently identified as fraud victims, having lost money to oil and gas scams and a variety of other things. And we asked them if they had been defrauded, and 60% of them said they had not been. So there's this gigantic error rate associated with asking, self-reporting, of both reporting to law enforcement about it, which is even a higher error rate or lower rate, whichever way you want to look at that, but also in terms of survey. And you know, there's a variety of reasons why that might be. It's really up to us to speculate why people don't come clean, they're embarrassed or whatever. But anyway, even if it's just 10% or 13%, that's a large number of people. And if you go to the Research Center for the Prevention of Financial Fraud website, which I don't have, but we will get for you, a lot of the studies I'm going to point to are on that website. And a lot of good work has been done in taking those studies and writing paragraphs in actual English about the study that summarizes them, which is really, I think, of tremendous value to the practitioner. And I think of myself as having one foot in the academic camp and one in the practitioner camp, so I'm looking out for my fellow practitioners. Another area in this financial fraud area is persuasion. And I just want to point to a couple pieces of research that we've done in that area. One is in this whole area, we have over the last 15 years interviewed probably 20 con men. These are people who used to work in these fraudulent boiler rooms or whatever, and they defrauded people. The feds or the state law enforcement arrest them, charge them, convict them, and just before they get sentenced, we go and we interview them in prison to find out what we can learn about how they do this, basically. And they all, when you ask them, well, what is the central strategy that you're trying to achieve here? How do you do it? They all say the same thing. And that is, we try and get the victim under the ether. But what is ether? Ether, they describe it as they describe it, and I'm just reporting what the con men say here, but they all say the same thing, is a heightened emotional state. And if I can get the person into a heightened emotional state, they're really excited about making a 10-to-1 return on their money, or they've won the lottery, or whatever the catalyst is, or the tactic is to get them there, then I can control them, and it's much easier to manipulate them. And this is where I think the neuroscience thing, and I'm looking at Sam McClure here, I have an agenda coming here, which is to persuade the neuroscientists in the room, which I am not, to do some more research on this. There have been studies done already. But this is where there's an intersection, I think, because the con artists are saying, I don't know if it's the neocortex or the amygdala or what it is. All I know is if I get them to not think logically, I can persuade them more easily, right? And so is this what's going on? Does this explain why there's so many victims who have PhDs and law degrees and are CEOs of companies who get defrauded and are really smart people? But it's not the smart part of their brain that's really engaged when they make that decision. It's the amygdala flooding out the neocortex. I don't know. We don't know. But I think that's an area that we could research. And the other piece of persuasion, if the central strategy then is to get people off balance into this heightened emotional state, what are the tactics they employ to do this? And historically in prevention, what we used to do is, and we still do this, is here are the top 10 scams that are going on in the United States right now. Foreclosure rescue scams, or whatever the scam might be du jour. But they change so much that you just can never keep up with it. So about 5 years ago, we got these undercover audio tapes from the Ohio Attorney General's office. What they did is a senior citizen who was being bombarded with phone calls was identified, and investigators took over the phone line and forwarded the phone calls to the Attorney General's office, and investigators posed as the senior and tape recorded all the incoming calls, and tape recorded 500 incoming calls, all different kinds of scams. And we took those tape recordings and transcribed all of them and then coded them to see what kind of persuasion tactics were employed that are across all the scams. So that you find, in other words, so this became a teaching tool. We find that there are these 4 or 5 discrete sort of persuasion tactics that are present in all of these scams. The number one tactic is something called phantom fixation or phantom wealth. Just, it seems obvious. It's like you're going to make $1 million or you're going to get a 10-to-1 return on your money. That was by far the most common. But another one, source credibility, wrapping the cloak of legitimacy around your operation. You're a scam, you want to look like you're legitimate. The source credibility is another tactic. Social consensus, everybody's doing it. There's a long line around the building, so it must be good. We have this idea in our head as a shortcut that if everybody is doing something, then it must be good. And so you can identify, I won't go through all of them, but there are these discrete tactics that we are able to identify that are all in the service of getting people into this heightened emotional state so you can control them and manipulate them. And so we're starting to learn a little bit more about, at least from the standpoint of what the strategy is by the con man and the tactics they employ. The other side of the transaction is the victim. And again, I'm talking more about the stranger talking to a person they don't know. But we've done a number of profiling studies. The most recent one was last year. We surveyed these, as I mentioned, these 723 victims and 1,500 members of the general population, and asked them a series of questions, both groups, of behavioral questions, demographic questions, psychological questions, to try and see if we could identify things victims do and who they are that are different, discretely different from the general population. And in fact, you find that there are things. One of them, not surprisingly, is we asked them a series of questions about how much they engage in the marketplace. Like, in the last 12 months, have you gone to a free lunch seminar? Or have you filled out, entered one of these free prize contests? A battery of questions about essentially exposing yourself to the marketplace. And that became one area where victims are discretely different. Victims are more likely to expose themselves to the marketplace. As Ken was saying, in Laura's research, as we age, we spend less time. I think this is an important finding because it's sort of consistent with this idea that when you're younger, you're out discovering the world and you're meeting new people and everything. But over time, you start to retract a little bit and you want deeper relationships with fewer people. And in fact, in the general population in this study, we sort of found that the older people were not engaged in the marketplace as much. But this group of victims continued. They liked the action. There's something about this, and we don't exactly know, that's all we know about it. They just engage more in the marketplace, which exposes them to these tactics and to legitimate tactics. They're also more interested in persuasion tactics that we've identified as clearly used by con men. So we give them a series of statements like, how interested would you be in the following statement? You could get a 50 to 100% return on this investment. And we ask that of the general population and of the victim population. And the victim population continues to say that they're more interested in what you and I might think of as an obvious pitch line than the general population. They're less likely to take prevention actions, like they're less likely to be signed up for the do not call register and that kind of thing. They're less likely to check out the background and references people before buying. And a new area, which we put into this survey really because of starting to work with the Stanford folks, this area of affective forecasting, which I've never even heard of before, and I'm still not sure I completely understand. But we worked with folks here at Stanford about this and asked them questions like, imagine that you just found $1,000. How would you feel, if you got $1,000? How happy would you be if you got $1,000? Or how upset would you be if you lost $1,000? And we asked this of the victims and the general population. And we did this because there were some studies that showed that, I believe it's older people, and comparing older people and younger people were equally happy at the idea of gaining. Am I getting this right, Laura? But older people were less upset by the prospect of losing money. And in our research, what we found is that investment fraud victims in particular, compared to the general population, were equally happy at the prospect of gaining money, but the investment fraud victims were less upset at the prospect of losing money. And this points to more research. Obviously, research begets research. But if you're thinking about the calculation of risk assessment and whether or not you should take a risk or not, and you're really happy at the prospect of getting a 10-to-1 return, but if you lose it, you just don't care as much as the general population. That upsets the equation, potentially. So that could be another thing that motivates them. And the last sort of risk factor I want to mention, which is, I think it's settled, but other people don't think it's settled. We argue about this, is age. Are older people more vulnerable and more likely to be victimized than younger people? Well, there's a debate, at least in my world of financial fraud, about this. I can tell you that the study we did of 723 victims, we didn't choose those people because they were old. We chose them because those were the lists that law enforcement was willing to give us. And the average age was 69. We've done probably 4 or 5 of these studies, side by side, general population and victims, and they're almost always over the age of 50. So is that because they all have cognitive impairment? Not necessarily. I mean, in that study that I was mentioning, also we're able to not only make comparisons between all the victims and all the general population, but we're also able to start profiling how victims are different from each other. And just take 2, the lottery victim and the investment fraud victim. The lottery victims were the stereotypical, the average age was 72, they were lower education, lower income, living alone, more likely to live alone, more likely to be female, and evidence that there is more cognitive impairment. We did a pilot study where we sent geriatric social workers into the homes of lottery victims and had them do a battery of in-home assessments, and 80% of them showed cognitive impairment of some kind. So there is that possibility that, you know, the reason you went for the lottery scam is because you're, you know, cognitively impaired. But the investment fraud victims are sort of diverging in the opposite direction. They're more likely to be married. They're more financially literate than the general population. They're wealthier than the general population. They have more education than the general population. And we haven't really tested for cognitive impairment, so I can't say whether they have them or not. But what explains that? What explains these CEOs of companies? And we had one list of investment fraud victims where the average loss amount was $300,000. There were 300 of them. The average loss amount was $300,000, and the list read like Stanford Business School graduates. I mean, they were all the presidents of companies and senior partners at law firms. Well, what's going on with them? And that's just a question I would throw out there. And just to conclude then, on the question of prevention, I've been very interested in this conversation we've had this morning, especially as it relates to, how do you reach people with information, and especially on the question of wisdom and peer, because we have this thing called the peer count, the fraud fighter call center in our Seattle office, where we train senior citizen fraud fighters to call people we think are vulnerable who meet these profiles and counsel them how to avoid fraud. And the peer-to-peer relationship, we think, is a key to why this works. And Stanford Center on Longevity last year helped us with a study to evaluate whether those interactions actually helped inoculate victims, and we found that it did significantly reduce their chances of being defrauded. And so I just throw that out there as a possible conversation. I think I'll stop there and let Steve go.
All right. You want to take this? Yep.
While they change mics, I'm happy to report that the Financial Fraud Research Center has a wonderfully logical URL. It is researchfraudcenter.org.
All right. I'm Stephen Vernon. I come to this field from
Fraud Research Center.org. It's so logical I got it wrong. Fraud, and all one word, no dots or anything, fraudresearchcenter.org. Sorry, Stephen.
Sure, that's all right. Neither a particularly scientific nor even an academic point of view. I've been a trial lawyer and dispute resolution lawyer for about 30 years. And about 20 years ago, I started to get involved increasingly in situations involving elders. In my world, I think that the questions quickly become deliciously complicated. When I'm dealing with a situation where an elder has been swindled, most typically by a stranger, it's pretty straightforward, and I quickly came to the point of view to realize why it happens so much, because it's so appalling to many of us that people would prey on the most vulnerable people. But it is precisely that, I think. My image is that elders are the moose calves of human society. They are relatively juicy, having acquired wealth over the course of their lives, and then their defenses start to break down. And there are a lot of wolves out there who see that opportunity and take advantage of it. There are powerful tools for dealing with that. But throughout these cases, I too am perhaps on a more speculative basis, trying to think through what's going on. And the most obvious thing that happens is what you hear a lot of lawyers describe as short-term memory loss, but by that they actually mean, I think, impairment of the ability to form and retrieve new memories, new long-term memories, if you're thinking of short-term memory as being more akin to what we can hold in consciousness at any time. You get some very straightforward frauds in that context. One example was a daughter who came to us, her father, who was living independently and whom she wanted to continue to live independently and be as much in control of his own life as possible, she discovered had paid a landscaper $5,000 for his work each day for 10 days in a row. And he had become involved in a number of other similar errors. So the most obvious thing to do is if somebody can't remember that they paid you, it's very easy to get multiple payments. I think that probably with multiple factors, you get the sense that people have more difficulty dealing with the complex challenge of detecting falsity and processing complex problems where they might have to retrieve data that is no longer so retrievable for them. And many elders get increasingly emotionally and physically vulnerable. And so you see a lot of situations in which caregivers come in and end up receiving massive gifts or entire estates, and then, bless you, perhaps after the elder dies, then the family surfaces and is shocked and appalled, and then there's a fight about that kind of swindle, which, if it's an inheritance, doesn't necessarily cause the elder too much trouble during his or her life, but certainly is contrary to what the elder probably wanted to happen. And there are some simple solutions that the law has created to address that problem. So that's the simple side of these fraud situations. And we have put into place some really powerful legal tools to protect elders. But it's a delicate dance, I think, both from a policy point of view and from an analytical point of view, because anytime that we start to really protect people, there's the danger that we are going to fail to respect people. And what comes to mind is something that one of my good friends told me, who had been an anesthesiologist running ICUs and CCUs, other facilities for one of the Kaiser hospitals. So he was constantly dealing with people at the end of their lives, at the failing part of their lives, and dealing with a family constellation that was addressing decision-making for them. And what he told me at a time when my own family was considering what to do about one of our parents toward the end of my mother's life. And he said that the worst thing about getting old is not getting sick or frail for most people, or even dying, actually. It is having your dignity and autonomy stripped away from you before you're ready to have that happen. And it's in that context of the competing concern for respect for elders and the desire to protect elders from predators that these policies are formed, and that those of us out in the legal field actually practice. What makes it so complicated, I think, for us is that the vast majority of transactions that I see that involve something akin to fraud do not involve strangers. They involve people within the center of elders' social lives, caregivers, and family members. And so, for example, if an elder makes a substantial gift to a caregiver, or a child who's living in the home and taking care of the elder, but there are 3 other children, do we see somebody exploiting physical and emotional vulnerability? Or do we see a mature adult who is grateful and perhaps making some conscious structuring decisions to encourage an ongoing, caring, and increasingly burdensome relationship that the elder wants and needs? So that's the real world for us, I think, out there in the trial world where we deal with that. And then it's very interesting because some of these same tools, legal tools that we have, that are wonderful weapons to rescue elders from bad situations, can, in essence, fall into the wrong hands and be used to push people into things that probably are wrong outcomes as well. So that makes it kind of well, certainly very interesting and engaging to practice in this field. I want to give one example that I think illustrates many of these. We had somebody come in to see us with his wife, whose ability to form and retrieve new memories was shot. I would have a conversation with him, and he would have no recollection of it 5 minutes later. He was forming new memories clearly, but with obviously substantial impairment. So that made him vulnerable in obvious ways. In addition, he had an obvious tendency to please whoever was in front of him. So when he was with his new wife, for example, he was all about pleasing her. When he was with his daughters, who were close to her age and hated her, he was all about pleasing them. And when you put them in his mind, even if they weren't present, it was very interesting to see him struggle with the balance between those two things. So that's a pretty simple picture, but complicating it was the fact that he still had an extremely keen intellect. I think he was widely recognized as a genius in his younger years, and still clearly smarter than any of the rest of us, even though he might not have been quite as sharp as he once was. He had definite points of view about what should happen. He came up with brilliant solutions when given the opportunity in the right context. And one of his solutions was, and this might be a general solution that might be useful for people trying to protect elders, was to augment his own intellect, but even more his own memory, by surrounding himself with social systems, people who would be responsible to know what was happening in his life and to help him to keep that in mind when he no longer had the ability to do it. So he had, in his case, he was able to afford a secretary. She did a lot of that for day-to-day matters. And he had good friends that he could use to augment his memory. And that, I think, is a very interesting general solution, at least to the extent that people still have social networks intact, to mitigate some of the problems that come with aging, especially memory and intellect problems. Well, so practitioners then, I think, can get engaged at multiple levels, and I suspect this afternoon's panel will address some of the things that you do in a planning level. From a trial lawyer's point of view, we'd certainly like to see people be alert for some telltale flags that are, for example, if somebody comes to you with an elder, in order for the elder to give them something, that is a warning sign. And regardless whether you're a banker or a lawyer or any other transactional professional, I think that's something you obviously raises concern, and then there are things you can do about it, like making sure you have isolated conversations with the elder. And there, if you happen to have an elder who has a severe loss of the ability to form and retrieve new memories, that's actually an advantage, because it makes it very difficult for the person who brought them in to coach them about what to say to you. And much more likely that you can have a conversation where you retrieve what they actually want. Obviously, missing funds, changes in title, these are things that family members can monitor, and often are what bring people in to see us. And then the complexity comes when you consider the question, who's the perpetrator here? Is it the caregiver or the caregiving child who is benefiting, or is it the stepchildren of the new wife who are very unhappy about what's happening? Is it, and then you look also at the history of giving. So you can put these things somewhat in context on the prevention side. We have plenty of tools to deal with these things. We always did, even before the wonderful new tools that people like Steve Reese, with whom I was talking a little bit earlier, have helped us to acquire. And for example, fraud. Fraud is unlawful, and there are powerful remedies for people who perpetrate fraud against any of us. And we have used those to undo bad transactions and to impose damages and even punitive damages on people who perpetrate fraud. There's conservatorship. If an elder's really gotten to the point where they no longer can protect themselves from handle their own finances, then the courts will allow somebody loved and trusted by them to take over control of those aspects of their lives. Estate planning is often used with triggers from doctors to allow elders to protect themselves. When people are in positions of trust, the laws always impose higher duties on them to not just refrain from lying, but to disclose important information and to put the interests of the elder before their own. But now we have some wonderful new tools, and again, we have to navigate in these complicated contexts to make sure that we don't use unduly blunt instruments. The criminal laws now allow prosecution of people who exploit elders. I cringe a little bit often when I see family members being prosecuted under these criminal laws, because often you'll see a caregiver child who maybe has a history of receiving generosity from a parent, and at some point, maybe the parent tipped over to the point where they no longer really understood what was going on anymore. Was it wrong for that child to continue to get these generous benefits? We have seen cases where children like that face criminal prosecution, when the other children who were unhappy about being treated unequally turned on them. And there are public guardianships, also a fairly blunt instrument often, where an elder is being exploited. Let me give you an example where we use that in a case. Elder is kidnapped, in essence, by a brother from another state and brought into California. The daughter had been taking care of her father for many years, and the brother started getting some financial benefit, took the elder to an incautious lawyer, from our point of view, who accepted everything the brother said about the terrible sister, but then represented the elder. And when you've got a lawyer representing an elder, it's potentially an unholy combination if they're credulous and in the service of a fraudulent kid. Because the courts assume that we do a pretty good job of taking care of our clients. The only way that we could get anywhere in that case was to engage the public sector. The public guardian came, we pushed hard, got a public guardian appointed. Immediately, the elder was no longer in charge of his own life. The other lawyers were out of the picture, and gradually, through a very traumatic process, the fraud was unraveled. But meantime, our client was temporarily banned from seeing her father, and she herself came under the microscope to make sure that none of the money that had been spent had been misspent. And so it's a rough ordeal to go that way. We've got under the Welfare and Institutions Code in California now, there are really powerful tools available. If somebody steals something from an elder, we can go grab it before trial using what are called writs of attachment and other provisional remedies. We have extended in our office emergency orders that were called CLETS orders that go to police departments that were originally designed really to protect elders from physical abuse, to get people, let's say somebody's living in a house that an elder doesn't want there. You often have to go through a lengthy eviction process. We've gone into court, showed a serious problem for an elder being exploited by the person in the house, and in 24 hours had a court order and a police department in there with guns drawn, removing the person from the house. And then at the end of the case, people are facing a threat of having to pay the attorney's fees of the other side, punitive damages, being disinherited, which is pretty powerful when you're dealing with a child. So we've got the tools. In fact, at this point, I think what often we need is some good judgment in addressing not just the elder's interest in having the maximum amount of money, but also having the maximum amount of relationships. and so often there's some really wonderful opportunities to do creative settlements that accomplish both goals. And one last thing I'll mention is that for caregivers specifically, the legislature came up with a very simple, very powerful solution, which is if an elder leaves money to a caregiver in the state of California without special legal measures having been taken to make sure that it's an independent choice, there is a presumption that that gift was obtained by undue influence, which can only be overcome by clear and convincing evidence.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and that's a very effective tool because you see that over and over again. You know, somebody at a point in their life where they're failing, somebody comes in, is getting $20 an hour to take care of them, and then walks out with a will giving them the $1 million house. So that's a brief image, I think, of the problem and some of the legal solutions to it. And with that, I think engage in the discussion.
Yeah, thanks. I'm a staff attorney with organizations that are nonprofit. For the last 16 years with problems of financial elder abuse. And in our world, we have elders that we're dealing with. They have two major fears: the fear of going into a nursing home, the fear of outliving their assets. We have two major groups of problems out there, one of which Stephen had talked about, which is the family member caregivers, next-door neighbors, and opportunists, criminal off the street. But there's a whole other area out there that Dale also mentioned, and these are the serial predators. These are the predators that are professionals. More likely than not, they're selling financial instruments such as an annuity, usually a deferred annuity. They're in the reverse mortgage world, and banking, and in other areas. We also have some problems with some attorneys that are taking advantage of their fiduciary relationship. But one thing that I wanted to bring forward here, and I really did get a lot out of Mr. McClure's presentation about the basal ganglia. I'm trying to learn my medicine as I go. There's another study out there by the University of Iowa called try to hope to get this one right, the frontal orbital cortex, real-life decision-making in normal aging. And that's a study that I saw a couple of years ago. And for me, that really answered a lot of the problems that I was seeing with people who are in their 80s or in their 90s buying 20-year deferred annuities. And you're wondering, I'm having a conversation with this individual. They sound okay. What's not working here? And this study showed that they looked at elders that were making decisions like people with traumatic brain injury were making decisions. And it was something like 35, 40% of those people that they studied that had no other indicia of cognitive impairment, they were making these bad financial decisions. And for me, that really helped to understand, because it was the orbital cortex, the way it was explained, that was the part of the brain that was losing its ability, but the brain was still going back to other areas to form a decision about something. And so when I hear somebody who is telling me that they wanted to buy a reverse mortgage, and over again, I'm hearing the person has $200,000, $300,000 of cash, but they're going to get a reverse mortgage. And a reverse mortgage is a very good product. If you need ready cash, you have no other resources. They're just expensive loans. And over, I was talking to one fellow from San Diego, and I said, why are you insisting that you need to get a reverse mortgage? And he said, because it's good. How do you know it's good? Because Robert Wagner told me it's good.
Wagner, yeah.
He is a celebrity.
Source credibility.
He is not a financial person, but this man was going to some place, and you see all these celebrities from the older world. And it struck me as when the Fonz is now selling these, that my time has come too. But the point is, it explains why people go to the part of the decision coming from someplace they're comfortable. And when we see things that are given to elders who go on to buy these annuities or get involved with the Veterans Aid and Attendance Program, everything with American flags, with eagles, with a time when these people were vibrant, that's where they're comfortable. So I think in what we're talking about, the science, if we can get more information about what's happening with the decision-making section, realizing that other parts of the brain is still firing, that would help to explain it. Because when we go to Sacramento, we're trying to get some legislation going. The big battle is, are you being patronizing? You're not taking, and one senator, I won't mention his name because, never mind, I could, but it won't do me any good. But, he said, no one's going to take the right of my mother to make her decisions away from her. She'll kick your ass if you try to do that. A lot of laughs came, but, there are people that need protection. But, we can't get the legislation going forward because it all becomes about something else. And the legislation is hearing from the lobbyists. They need to hear from science that there is a problem. We need to really take the science to show the legislators, yes, we've got to make some other decisions about protecting the elders. Nobody wants to take all the rights away, but society made a decision about you can't form contracts unless you're 18. I've been emancipated. And what happens when you're 65? We need to take a look at that because there's a substantial amount of the population that has lost enough ability so they really can't protect themselves when a professional predator comes at them. And again, I'll just finish by saying, when we see these people, they get hit, these professionals are unbeatable. They get the senior, they're using fear, they're using anger, they're using greed. They have that person, the person has no idea, they're terrified about going into a nursing home. It's all used against them. We don't have those kinds of laws to protect the people from the serial predator. It's really out of control. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, and I just want to mention one of the other scams that we ran into and dealt with successfully related to the reverse mortgage situation. We had an elder who had taken out a loan from a finance company, but then started getting phone calls from an employee of the finance company encouraging her to take out relatively small additional amounts of money secured by her home, say $5,000. But each of these transactions would involve a comparable amount of money for processing costs of the transaction. So it was just this ridiculously horrible deal. And she got herself into a fairly deep financial hole fairly quickly. And when we attacked using the legal weapons that are available, we were able to basically put her back on level ground, and probably better off than she would have been had she not borrowed in the first place. So, and there I think they were exploiting the trust that they had acquired from being her lender in the first place.
I also worry about the aggressiveness of these comments. Just last week, our call center talked to a person, adult protective services worker, who intervened in behalf of an elder who had lost $300,000 to the lottery scam. These guys from Jamaica, I'll just say it, from Jamaica, were the most aggressive. And this is what they do. The adult child finally intervened, and that's a whole nother area we could talk about how difficult it is to intervene when someone gets hooked on this, throwing good money after bad thing. But these guys she stopped responding to the phone calls. So they would send a florist to her home to knock on the door to give her flowers and then tell the florist to hand the phone to her so that they could talk to her, right? Or they would send a cab driver to her house and tell the cab driver to go and knock on the door with their cell phone so they could get, and then they would just harass her, you know? I mean, this is just an example of the level of predation that is going on here. Once you, and the thing we didn't talk about so much that is like it starts with send in $15 direct mail, and once you send in that $10 or $15, within days you're getting 15, 20 mailers, and then it just, it just explodes, and then the predators start calling you. And so it very much is like identification of weakness and then just devouring them. And how we build containment systems around that. I mean, we're trying by doing peer counseling where we call the people, and if it's someone like that, we'll call them back every week. But, that's, I mean, the stuff you talked about with guardianships, I've had to do that myself where there was no other relative and I had to have a public guardianship appointed, and it was torturous. The person who had lost all this money said, "You're taking away my independence and you're taking away my dignity." I'm like, yeah, but they're taking away all your money. I mean, you're not going to have anything to live on, so.
Thank you very much for your talk. I think it's important that we have people like you looking out for the vulnerable. We'll hopefully, knock on wood, all have the chance to be aging and elderly someday. So my question really is maybe for everyone. I don't know if it's fair to target it specifically at you, but it seems like there are a lot of psychological dimensions at play here, and they could be all related. The ability to trust or increase levels of trust seems to be underlying a lot of this, which might be correlated with increased religiosity or reduced cynicism. So I'm on the opposite side. If someone comes knocking on my door, I assume they're trying to exploit me. And even if it's the Girl Scouts, I don't answer the door.
Predator Girl Scouts.
But it could be related to this idea of reduced cynicism. I also come from Utah, where there is a high level of multi-level marketing fraud targeted at the elderly who are members of the Mormon Church by other members of the Mormon Church. They're not legal fiduciaries, but they're kind of moral fiduciaries, and they talk about this, what did you call it, the social credibility or the group credibility? Source credibility.
Source credibility, right.
That if you get this high return on your investment, you can then return it into a tithe for the church. And it's not as well known nationally, but it's a huge problem in Utah.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if there have been neuroscience or psychological studies looking into trust games in the elderly, ultimatum games. Seems like it's not likely that they have higher levels of oxytocin, but I don't know about that empirically. Maybe they have reduced conflict error monitoring so that when something doesn't fit with their background knowledge, they're not getting that ACC or like anterior cingulate activity. I'm just curious if anyone knows anything about these kinds of studies that might focus in on what exactly it is about increased trust, reduced cynicism that might be playing off these vulnerabilities.
On the brain science, I have no idea. But from the standpoint of talking to con men and saying, the whole idea is to change the relationship from salesman, victim, to friend, sitting on the same side of the table. And one guy said he would pray for hours with the person. They find out what you're motivated by, and then they go there with you. I sort of mentioned there was a case several years ago called Greater Ministries. I don't know if you've heard of this, but it was a couple scam artists who infiltrated churches in the South, and they end up taking in $500 million and scamming 18,000 people on the premise that they had this double your money program, that God would double your money. And there was passages in Scripture that said, God, give and you shall receive. God didn't say give and you might receive. He said, give and you shall receive. And they videotaped all of their presentations, and the feds finally took them down. But what you see in the context of that presentation is getting people out of the thinking part of their brain, because it starts with the Pentecostal worship service, in which everybody's swaying. I mean, there's nothing wrong with this if it's legitimate, but they weren't legitimate. They were getting people into the ether, into whatever that is. And I think this is totally unexplored, which I hope we do explore more of what exactly the mechanisms are there. But when you interview the victims, it was all about, these are my church brethren who are, I mean, they're all doing it. If you can't trust God, who can you trust, kind of stuff. And it's, you know.
Well, and I just think, just one quick follow-up, it may not be that that's the irrational part of their brain. It might just be tapping into something that they value rationally, but it may seem irrational to us. But
Yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you.
I find this very fascinating, and what you were talking about, as you're describing the different mechanisms that the con men use to really try to get people into this emotional state, you were saying, they want to get them out of their thinking brain. You know, for me, when I was listening to that, I was looking at it from the neuroscience perspective of, you know, it sounds like they're really trying to trigger this person's limbic system, and we know that as we age, and the gentleman over here mentioned that the studies that show that the prefrontal cortex, there is degradation in that area, and we know that that area is involved in helping us make decision-making, involved in decision-making. So I was just very curious, I think you just answered it, that, I mean, I would love to see a neuroscientist take a look at your work and commented it scientifically, and say, because even like the example you just gave about the Jamaican scam artist who call someone and say, oh, this person, they're not responding, so let's send the florist over there. In my mind, I was thinking, well, that's an immediate dopamine response. Someone gets the flowers, it triggers the reward system. They're happier. Now they're at that in that state of mind. You're processing differently, and you're also triggering not the logical side of the prefrontal cortex. You're now actually triggering the limbic system and the fear versus reward, and now you're putting that person in a state where they're more susceptible to these things. So anyway, to my comment is, or my question is, when will you have a neuroscientist go through what you've done and comment on the step-by-step process of here's what's happening in a person's brain neurologically? Because even the comment of oxytocin, you know, to understand that, because you're talking about trust. I mean, oxytocin is involved in trust. To understand that, I think, would be very, very powerful and insightful.
Totally, couldn't agree more. I'm not a neuroscientist, but if I could persuade any to, well, I mean, you know, some of this work is being done. The FINRA Foundation has funded some work. Sam, do you want to talk about any of the FINRA stuff at all, or, I mean, no? Not really. I'm not sure what the update is. Some work is being done there, but more could certainly be done, and it is the frontier for sure.
And you do see it on both sides, both on the positive and negative side. One elder came to us because she was receiving telephone calls threatening her with governmental proceedings or even prosecution because of a fictitious unpaid debt. And so if she didn't send them the money, they were, you know, all hell was going to descend on her. It was pretty effective. And after we first established that there was no such legitimate threat to her, she continued to be pushed to the brink. In her case, she was able to resist, but pushed to the brink of paying them off to stop that kind of onslaught. Works both negative and positive emotionally.
Hi, my question is for Doug. I was wondering a little bit about the peer counseling, and you said it can be effective in fraud prevention. I'm kind of wondering how you identify, you said you tend to do that with people who match this profile, who
Yeah.
could potentially be victims. How do you, I mean, are you taking surveys of the population to pinpoint these people, or how does that work
Yeah.
exactly?
Well, you know what we used to do is we used to, figuratively anyway, fly over a football stadium and drop 60,000 brochures out onto the stadium, hoping that if we reached everyone with things like, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is, then we'd reach the smaller subset that's actually going to be victimized. A very inefficient way to do this. And very late in the game, we figured out that if you profiled people and figured out who was more like, that while anyone can be taken, some people are more likely to be taken than others, I guess is a way to summarize it. So we know that people who are over 70 years old, female, high school education, living by themselves, are much more likely to fall for the lottery scam than the general population. So we either get lists of names, right now we're using lists of names of people who've already been scammed, because we also know they're much more subject to the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, especially on this. So that's who we're calling. We're not calling the general population, we're calling people over the age of 70 who live by themselves, who are, meet that profile. And you can buy those names too, just commercially purchase them. We're also calling the profile of the investment fraud victims and giving them the peer counseling. And the research, the way we tested this was kind of interesting. We took, I don't know, it was 1,500 lottery victims. This is the hardest people to change behavior, theoretically. And we put them into two groups. One group received the peer counseling, the other group did not, but we called them and asked them what their favorite TV program was. And then we hired a professional former con man to call both groups and try and sting them to see whether the group that got peer counseling responded less frequently than the group that did not. And there was about a 33% difference. A month later, in some, there was 2 weeks and a month, but, with a delay even. And I saw that as very hopeful. It doesn't solve the problem by any stretch of the imagination. But there is evidence that this really does. And again, that work is not trying to reduce the amount of fraud that's out there. It's trying to increase the resistance of people who are particularly vulnerable. So
It is kind of scary that you can buy lists of names of people who've been defrauded. That means a con man could also buy those lists. And
yes, it does. Yes.
So I just have a couple of quick questions. So one of them is that, yes, there is a sort of an identified group of people that we specifically see in the health setting who are more vulnerable. So again, to the point that whether they live alone, they need that sense of engagement, a purpose, somebody paying attention to them, and maybe some associated cognitive impairment. My specific question is, I cannot tell you how many times we see a patient that really needs the money for in-home care or other amenities and is sort of spending it either on a scam or lottery or whatever it is. At our resort, we have this mandatory reporting in the hospital. If you suspect abuse or anything, you have the sheet to fill out, but our recourse is really to call APS.
Yeah.
And when we call APS, nothing happens. There is a social worker that goes out, does something preliminary, but I have so many cases which are just stuck there where, how do we get to people like you, or who moves it? Where is the policy on that? Because it's stuck in APS, and APS is not giving us anything back. And all we care about is the clinical outcomes of this patient. The ability to be able to get what they need, or even get some care at home, or even be able to use some of the money for whatever it is. So very, very muddy, between families and caregivers and APS.
And some of the audience who may not know, APS is...
APS is Adult Protective Services. That's our only recourse to call when we suspect something in the interview or when we talk to the patient.
Yeah, and I think one pathway is that people get referred to senior adults legal assistants or to elder abuse lawyers who then can help people. But as the questions were being posed, I was thinking that there is an opportunity, probably through HMOs and other healthcare providers to engage with with people like Doug, and perhaps to set up the option of programs for people who run into the kind of diagnoses that would predispose them to vulnerability to scams.
I mean, we could do peer counseling with those folks. It's not casework. It's not case management. And Adult Protective Services is completely overwhelmed in Washington State. I don't know about California, you know, and budget cuts are going to exacerbate that. So it's really, I would not want to be an APS worker. I mean, they're really.
I just wanted to bring people's attention to a book that might be of interest. It's by a psychologist, Stephen Greenspan, who's a professor of psychology emeritus, University of Colorado School of Medicine. It's called The Annals of Gullibility. And many of his chapters, he starts out basically citing stories, literature, religion, and so forth. His goal is to really extract some of the psychological themes and constructs that might then be relevant for investigation, and brings together what he refers to as really the scant body of psychological research addressing the topic. But he's a very clear thinker and very engaging writer, and it might be food for thought on some of these
absolutely.
issues. And he actually has a chapter on vulnerable populations that does speak to seniors.
Thank you.
Kind of a two-part question. The first is, I see a lot of resonance in between what you're talking about with elderly and then what goes on with traumatic brain injury, which is an instance that I happen to personally be in. I'm a caregiver for someone who's 56. It seems everything we seem to be talking about that's going on there, he's going through the exact same symptoms because he's had a quarter of his frontal lobe removed and whatnot. I was wondering if you've done any research with people who are also doing work with traumatic brain injury. And the second thing that I seem to be picking up is this resonance with what was talked about yesterday with adolescents. Adolescents and elderly has always been some joke that's been tossed around, but one of the things we've seen about the brain is its incredible ability for adaptability. And it seems that from going into adolescence to young adult or whatnot, we talk about the ability for reason and judgment. And it seems that as you seem to be getting older, that degrades. So you start going back to your older systems, or we think your more primal systems, the amygdala or whatnot. Whereas instead of having recourse to reason, you do other recourse to authority. And it seems what takes place there is you become your own authority. You ask the question, why do CEOs get bamboozled all the time? Well, you know, my father-in-law, who I'm taking care of, is a former CEO. The first thing he does now is he says, hey, I can make these decisions. I used to be a former CEO. Why do I need to know what the difference between a nickel and a dime is? So we tend to, and I'd say it's one of our biases. I mean, we're here at Stanford at Law and Neuroscience. We all make recourse to our logos immensely, and that's what we see as our strength. But what happens when your memory becomes that logistical factory? That is where all your logic. I don't know this. Is this something that's being studied? Is this something, and what's going on here? And what's going on with health professionals? We've talked to maybe 50 neurosurgeons, not a single neurosurgeon, and this seems to be an emerging field. We now have capabilities to resuscitate, to prolong people who have experienced brain injury. But the neurosurgeons or the health profession doesn't seem to be very well versed on what's going on in policy. And so we're caregivers and we have APS called on us and they say, well, we don't really know what to do. What's going on in the health field with this? Sorry, I know that's packed a lot there.
I don't really know about the traumatic brain research. I can tell you that one of the biggest barriers there is to doing fraud prevention work, though, is something called the illusion of invulnerability. And the health psychology literature identified this 20 years ago, which is people get cancer, but I won't. Well, if you don't think you're ever going to get cancer, you're never going to take any steps to not get cancer. And the exact same thing is true in this domain. Whether you're a CEO or not, people just assume they're too smart to ever fall for any of these scams. And we're really bad at putting ourselves in those highly charged, persuasion-laden situations and knowing how vulnerable that makes us too, right? These hot, cold empathy gap thing. When you're not hungry, you don't know how hunger really affects you very well. So when you're in that persuasive situation, you think you can defend against it. even though there, as somebody said, it's like playing one-on-one basketball with Michael Jordan, right? You're way outmanned every time in the persuasion field. So I mean, I think that may be one reason why the CEOs, they have this illusion that they're going to be able to, they're still Michael Jordan, maybe. Maybe they were at one time, but, you know, I don't know, so.
And I just want to note that again, in California, there are enhanced legal tools, not just to protect elders from financial and physical abuse, but basically the same set of tools is available to protect disabled adults. So if you have somebody with a brain injury who qualifies as disabled, there are really powerful legal tools to protect them from abuse as well.
Thank you.
I keep thinking about technology and technological solutions as I'm listening to you, because it sounds like there are a lot of different things people can do, but they're all kind of hit and miss and touch and go. You know, you say trust your kids, but it's the kid who's stealing, or trust your wealth manager, and it's, you know, Bernie Madoff's. And I mean, there's just nothing that works for sure. But Visa and MasterCard are really good at knowing when something unusual is happening. And if we could put something like that into effect at the banks, it would seem like that might be a way to detect without having to make these kind of sweeping age-based policy decisions, which are going to put in a whole lot of competent people in a tough situation. But it would alert individuals and police and all sorts of people. It just seems possible, but I wondered if anybody's doing anything like that.
Well, you know, it's a good place to catch it. I'm not sure that the law is that terrible at handling the tension between respect for the elder and protection for the elder. It's not that easy to conserve, for example, an elder, which is one of the ways you would take control away.
Yeah, I'm thinking way before conservatorship. I mean, so and a lot of these things do get mixed up. It's like we've had people with dementia are one category of the elderly, but a minority of the elderly, and that seems like a different population to think about different protections like conservation. But
the credit card companies are very good at fraud detection, because if they don't detect it, they pay.
exactly.
So creating financial incentives or disincentives, whichever, to protect people. And, like, you know, I mean, this is a debate going on now with, you know, credit card companies versus wire transfer companies versus, you know, overnight delivery companies. If there was if you had to pay, if it turns out to be fraud and you have to eat the loss, you know, my credit card company calls me when I go out of town, like I drive 30 miles away. You can't use that in Bellevue, you live in Seattle, you know. How do they know?
I mean, it just seems like something people could even sign up for, and it wouldn't be
Yeah.
insulting. I'd sign up for it.
Yeah.
You know, it should know that if something funny is going on.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean you're not competent to defend yourself, but why not have it? Yeah. I think that's another frontier we need to look for.
I realize we're running out of time, so I'll try to be quick, but I appreciated your talks very much, and I thought they complemented each other very well, because on the one hand, we started off with discussion of fraud, and Mr. Byrne, your talk seemed to remind us that there are ways that vulnerable people can be preyed on that fall short of fraud, that are perfectly legal, and protecting people who may have some deficits but are basically competent from making foolish decisions seems even more difficult than detecting outright fraud or preventing outright fraud. The example of casinos actually comes to mind. Secondly, you mentioned in the context of the fraud that a key tactic was putting people into this emotional state.
Yeah.
And I realize that you're talking about sort of interpersonal frauds where there are a lot of personal contact. I'm curious whether you've paid any attention to internet fraud. And the reason that I ask is I am close to an older gentleman whose skepticism seems to evaporate when presented with information from the web. Even in contexts in which you would think he was not in a particularly aroused state emotionally, emails will be forwarded that contain facially incredible claims that have been apparently received with enough credulity to be forwarded.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you've seen anything on that, if you have any research on that, if you've seen any evidence that older people are more, those who use email are more likely to be responding to Nigerian princes.
Well, I could only speculate about that in a strictly research sense. The internet is just another channel, of course, like the direct. But we have interviewed hundreds of people who get mail, and the mailman coming to the door is the main social interaction they have. And another challenge is just the old school way of thinking about how hard it used to be to type a letter. And this must be true because my name is in this letter like 8 times. And therefore, they must have for sure been writing just to me. When you and I both know, but that's just a word, that's just like a button, a couple buttons, right? And it makes me wonder whether there's some of that mindset going on now, even for a particular cohort of people. I don't have evidence this is true, but getting an email letter is like, well, they must have really taken the time and it must be real there. That's the credibility source of it, is because they're writing directly to me. I don't know. But I have interviewed enough people where they said that it must be true because they said, Joan, you want to do this? Joan, you know? So, I mean, I do think that makes it vulnerable. And the research we found that showed people exposure, these researchers from Arizona State did a study of the population that found that, just like our study, it actually corroborates our study that shows that the more internet purchases they made, the more victimization occurred, that actually buying stuff on the internet correlated to victimization. So there is some evidence of that.
Laura, I love that idea about Visa and MasterCard. And my wife and I were caregivers for an 88-year-old neighbor, and he had a day caregiver who would come in, and it was, in fact, Visa who they called up the house, and we happened to be there that particular day, and talked to us about some unusual expenses at liquor stores, I think a gun store, and something that obviously our old neighbor really hadn't gotten to before. And I think the idea that technologies like this could assist with the cognitive issues that we're all going to be facing someday is fantastic. But I'm wondering here, I wanted to thank her for that, but to lead into an issue which really fascinates me, and that is what research is being done in other parts of the world. And Rita talked a little bit about this in India, China, and Japan specifically. Do you have any awareness of what research is being done in fraud and others? I don't think the situation is as bad, though it possibly is in Europe, especially where Eastern Europe is meeting Western Europe.
Yeah. There's a lot of studies. There's something called the International Crime Victim Survey that they do once every 4 years, the UN does, that gauges the prevalence of fraud. But the UK has done a lot of good research on fraud, the Netherlands. There's studies all over the world now about this. And that sort of brings us back to the center in the sense that we're trying to gather all of those together now and put them in one place. Laura was telling me last night that the person running the center found something like 350 studies in 272 different journals or something like that. I mean, they're just all over the place. So I would direct you to the center, because I think there's a lot of them. I know I've given them a lot of them. Everything I have that was on my Mac at home went right to the center. So.
Last question.
Okay, I have 2 comments, not questions. One is that in California, it's one of 8 states that banks are mandated reporters of elder financial abuse.
Yep.
I took your idea about credit cards, why can't the banks do this and have something internal? I took it to our legislators, and it ended up with the law that we have today. But I still think we need to get to the legislators and do what you said, just make it an automatic thing. So I just wanted everyone to know that in California, we have that in place, and I take responsibility for that. And number two, on adult protective services, the reason that they say APS doesn't do anything is APS's mantra is the person has the right to folly. So if I want to give all of my money to my caregiver, unless somebody says that I do not have the mental capacity to, I can do that. So for the researchers and all, I think APS needs a new mini mental, because most everybody can pass that mini mental, and when they do, then they have freedom to give away all their money.
Yep.
So thank you.
That's exactly right.
And I'll just note that one of the recent questioners, and this one again raised the point, from a point of view of being able to fix something that's done wrong, you don't have to show fraud. There's a whole range of influence short of fraud that is reversible, and the most obvious name for such a category of influence is undue influence, where you however you manage to do it, you persuade somebody to do something that's obvious folly, then the assumption that they chose to do it is violated, and the transaction can be undone.
Well, please join me in thanking the panelists.